Welcome. I'm Ron Baker, Director of the Canadian Small Church Ministry Center, and this is us, Small Churches in Action.
My name is Tim Perry. I'm currently the Dean of the Seminary and Professor of Theology at Providence Theological Seminary in Otterburn, Manitoba. I have served in parish ministry for two denominations and in two very different contexts. My first parish was downtown urban center in Northern Ontario, and any problem that you can imagine with an urban center in Northern Ontario, I've lived through it with my parishioners. And my other church was a small village church in Anglo-Quebec in the Ottawa Valley. And it was at that point that I supplemented my income by working part-time for the local funeral home as well. And that's in part where this conversation came from.
All right. Yes, this conversation is, we're going to jump into a whole discussion of funerals and looking at that and how that, I just have some questions that are right on the tip of my tongue, because I've also assisted in a funeral home as well, and seen probably some of the things that you've seen, I've seen, and we'll just chat a little bit about that. One of the things I noticed right away as a young pastor, that funerals are a very memorable time, but also a very difficult time for pastors and for the family that is affected by funerals. How would you describe some of that, both sides to the effect that funerals have? Well, I guess it's the deaths of loved ones and that type of thing. Yeah.
For sure. Well, in addition to the whole grieving process that happens with any death, whether it's sudden or the end of a lengthy disease or a tragedy, when the end comes, it comes suddenly. By that I mean the pastor and the family together have to make a whole bunch of decisions that range from the trivial to the very, very important, kind of all at once. When I worked, when I did my stint at the funeral home in Shawville, in one of my training manuals, I'm not quite sure where my boss generated this number, but he said that families typically have to make about 127 decisions that arise either directly or indirectly from the death of their loved one, and they simply need help with it. And those decisions, even as you plan for them and prepare for them as best you can, a lot of them simply cannot be made until the event actually happens. And so that whole being thrust into things, that feeling of suddenness adds a complicating measure, I think, both for pastors and for the family. And then you overlayer that with grief, with all the attendant mixed emotions that come with death. I mean, lives are complicated. It's my experience that, even the saintliest of people who, to use the scriptural language, dies old and full of years, they leave behind complications just because they're human beings. And all of that kind of comes together, and it makes this time in a family's life and in a church life a particularly challenging one, for sure.
Yeah, I've found in my own experiences the threads that people thought were all taken care of, they've frayed a little bit at the end. And sometimes 10 years ago it was all ready, now it's not. And as you say, 127 decisions. Sometimes I wonder if it's not a lot more than that. And
it could well be.
Yeah, and it just seems to come so quickly. Afterwards, you're expected to have a funeral right away, or you're working through questions, and it just makes for a real hard time for some families.
Yeah, it does, for sure.
Yeah. So what kind of advice would you give for the small town pastor or the small church pastor, or yeah, as they move into this um, time for funerals? And I think COVID has added a whole new dimension. Maybe you want to talk a little bit about that too.
COVID has, for sure. It's done some strange things.
Mm-hmm.
It's first of all, it's made it very, very difficult, if not sometimes impossible, for families to gather for a funeral. And so you end up with a really odd dynamic where either nothing at all happens when a loved one dies, outside the bounds of immediate family, or the duration between someone's death and their funeral is much longer than it used to have been, like 6, 7, 8 months sometimes.
Yeah.
Maybe, in northern climates, we might be kind of used to an interruption in the funeral service because the ground's too frozen to do an interment. But the interruption between the actual death and the funeral service, I think, is a new thing that COVID has given us too. But I don't know that I'd change my advice a whole lot. And it's this. I mean, in the moment of funeral planning, that's going to happen whether you're ready for it or not. So there's not much that I can say about that to a pastor of a mega church or to a pastor of a flock of 50 people. Mm-hmm. What I would say to both of those is talk or preach about death more than you do. Not everyone in your parish is going to need a series of sermons on how to manage money, either because they know how to do it already or they don't have any.
Yeah.
Not everyone is going to need to have a series of sermons on how to have a happy marriage. Mm-hmm. It's another podcast, I'm sure, but churches, I think, like ours, are notoriously bad at caring for single adults, mm-hmm. Particularly younger single adults. But everybody in your parish is going to die. They're not just going to know someone who's going to die, they're going to die. Yeah. And that means, it seems to me, if we're going to be faithful to our calling as ministers of word and sacrament, that we're going to have to hold that eventuality before them and walk with them through what the gospel says about human mortality. And that means death should be a regular topic of our preaching, so that when the sudden moment comes, and like I said before, all deaths have a certain kind of suddenness to them, mm-hmm. because there are some things you have to do that you can't do beforehand. Yeah. When that sudden moment comes, your people and you will already have some tools in the tool shed. Mm-hmm. And so at least that part of the kerfuffle will be looked after.
So if you were going to teach on death to a congregation, I mean, a theology class, I guess you could go into all sorts of things. And probably when you're speaking to congregation, you want to bring that out. But if you could give an outline for a pastor to say, here's 2, 3, 4 things that you should cover maybe once every 2, 3, 4 years, and make sure people know this about death, what would you come up with?
Well, the 4 big last things, mm-hmm. in eschatology are the things I think that pastors need to cover regularly.
Okay.
And those are death, judgment, hell, and heaven. In the traditions that we come from, Ron, I expect that if most people know what the word eschatology means, they start thinking about, those end time charts and when the rapture will be and who might the Antichrist be and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, riding horses. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a place for that, and I'm not minimizing it, but that stuff has kind of consumed what eschatology is, I think, for a lot of preachers. And so they either rush into it a little too much and scare people away,
Yeah.
or they're kind of scared themselves, and so they never get to it. And eschatology does cover that stuff, but it really is about far more mundane things, like the fact that we're going to die and what happens afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
And that should come up regularly. In the old Anglican church calendar, those four themes came up every year. They were the 4 Sundays of Advent.
Yeah.
None of this, hope, joy, peace, love business.
Mm-hmm.
We got ready for the coming of Jesus at Christmas by talking about death.
Yeah.
And after that, the judgment, and where we would end up as a result of the judgment, namely hell or heaven. And I mean, obviously, I'm not prescribing for anyone what they need to do on the 4 Sundays before Christmas, but those are things that should come up regularly. And if you only ever talk about those things at the funeral, you're not doing them justice.
Yeah,
because there's so much going on at the funeral. I think you've got to stick with really a simple presentation of the gospel, because that's all people can manage at that point in time.
Yeah, I think part of what we've lost is vocabulary, and I think that's what you're talking about. Is so when you go to a sermon, we've already heard this word before about judgment. We've already heard, and so it makes sense that you can preach and people will understand. But some in our day and age, we back into a very, well, I think you've maybe mentioned it as we have a whole different approach to funerals nowadays, made up by the family or by someone else, and the pastor just sort of gets inserted into it. Maybe you can talk a little bit about your thoughts on how to best guide families regarding the funeral.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's simply part and parcel of living in 21st century Canada, that a funeral, like a wedding or a savings account or a credit card or a loaf of bread, is something that we buy. And it makes sense, that we would think that at one level, because we do. Either we make an appointment with the funeral director and we give them our wishes, and the funeral director says to us, okay, you can pay so much now and we'll lock it in, or we'll keep these on file, and when the event happens, then you'll write us a check and we'll take care of these wishes for you. So there's an economic exchange.
Oh yeah.
The problem is when we take for granted that that's all a funeral is, and therefore that the purchaser of the product gets to decide what they do with it. And that's particularly for pastors in smaller churches, in rural churches, may actually have an easier time with this, because the deep connections amongst neighbors and family aren't as atrophied, I think, as they are in urban contexts. But there's a whole lot more going on in a funeral than simply the purchasing and arranging of a product into which, as you put it, a pastor is inserted. It's a rite of passage in which a family takes their loved one where they need to be. They're moving them from the community of the living to the community of the dead. Quite literally.
Yes, yeah.
More metaphorically, but no less truly, for the believers, we're acknowledging that our loved one has transitioned from the church militant here on earth to the church triumphant in heaven. And we've got to move them from this spot out the building to the next spot. And that movement is bigger than any one person. It's bigger than any one family, and it's far more than any one product that anybody can purchase. And Christians have been doing this for a long time, using specific words in specific ways to help families make this transition that's bigger than them. So the challenge for any pastor is to help families understand that what's going on is bigger than what they bought. And what they bought is part of it, but they're not actually in charge of it, because there's a whole lot more going on there. The pastor has the responsibility of being a faithful minister to a family in the valley of the shadow of death.
Yeah.
But there's more to it than that. If your family belongs to a church community, there's the responsibility of that community to come around that family and love them in really practical kinds of ways. So in another podcast, I was asked, what can ordinary people do? And my first response was bring food.
Yeah, exactly.
Because there are so many practicalities that only the family can look after, and they're in a state of spiritual distress and emotional turmoil already, that if we can take just some basic stuff off their plate by putting a casserole in their freezer, that is effective, powerful gospel ministry, and it shouldn't be minimized. That's a really important thing to do. So there's lots of things that small churches, rural churches can be coached into, and I don't think it would take a whole lot of coaching.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I've just been part of, helped perform a funeral service this weekend, but of course it's accepted in our community. I'm in a small church in rural Saskatchewan. It's accepted in our community that the funeral is not just a bunch of words that somebody reads, but it's the words they read, and then it's the food that we eat afterwards, and the comfort and that we provide around tables afterwards. And even I know I could have a little discussion on eulogies with you here, but within the service itself, it's expected in a smaller community that you're going to talk a little bit about who they are. And that's part of it. And then it's expected that the pastor is going to provide a discussion of God as related to. And I remember doing one funeral I was asked to do. And at this funeral, I had chatted with this fellow before. He knew he wasn't going to heaven like I would describe heaven. So I just said, here's the discussion we had. And we talked all about heaven, hell, and his discussion and his side and my side. And it actually ended up being a very well accepted opportunity to present a gospel, even though in our community, somebody needed to do the funeral service for this person who was not religious in the way we would say he would be religious. It was a great opportunity. So I don't know why I got off on that sidetrack there, but take it away, Tim.
Well, before we leave food, maybe to talk about eulogies, I want to say I think there's really good biblical precedent for it. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies, says the psalmist. And in my experience, as a kind of an on-call chaplain at a funeral home, families with little to no church heritage, they know the 23rd Psalm still.
Oh, yeah.
If they've got any kind of church connection generations back in their background, they know the 23rd Psalm, and they will often ask for that to be read or to be the main passage of scripture in a funeral service. And I love to camp on that verse just to remind people that, the wake before or the reception after is a really important part of what we're doing. And it's an important spiritual part of what we're doing, because it's sitting around those tables eating cheese and pickles and egg salad sandwiches, that the good shepherd is keeping the enemies at bay, so that in the midst of this we can eat together. And he makes them watch while we eat, and it makes them mad, the enemies, that is. And I think that's a great thing.
That's a great picture. I love it. Yeah.
And so that, food sounds like such a trivial thing. And, there might be a temptation for some of us to say, we're doing the gospel ministry while the ladies are just making the sandwiches. Those sandwiches are very, very important.
Mm-hmm.
And they're prepared with as much love and prayer as any sermon, and they need to be valued.
Yes.
So I just want to say that about food. Eulogies are risky.
Some days they can be, yes.
They're really, really risky. But I think they're worth the risk, particularly if the preacher doesn't know the person they're burying very well.
Yeah.
Because it frees the preacher to actually preach the gospel. You don't have to, nor should you, give a second eulogy.
Mm-hmm.
So by all means, draw the person's life into the word, allow it to be absorbed by the text, for sure. But the preacher is there to do something different than remember the times he went fishing with Jim.
Right. Yeah.
You're literally standing between the living and the dead, and you've got good news
Mm-hmm.
for those people. So you better give it to them.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, which comes to a regular saying that one of the pastors I worked with would always say. It says, the funeral is for the living and not for the dead.
Yep.
In the sense of, glad you're here, but you need to hear this. And so it's a hearing time and an interaction time. Yeah, very much so.
So I was asked once, well, do you talk about heaven a lot in a funeral sermon? And I said, no, I don't. I don't talk a whole lot about hell either. Because it's not my job to insert myself in the place of the judge, who is always and only God, and who alone will do the right.
Mm-hmm.
It is my place to talk about Jesus, who has died for all of us. And for those who are his, in their deaths, they've not stepped over into nothing.
Mm-hmm.
They've stepped over into his loving embrace. Yeah. And whatever that is before the resurrection, it's good. And something to be to take comfort in.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. I think if we're talking too much about heaven as the family reunion, Jim's been reunited with his dad and his Uncle Terry or whatever, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think it trivializes the whole thing, but it's far more important that in Jim's death, Jim fully identified with Jesus who died. And because he fully identified with Jesus who died, we hope for Jim's resurrection because he shares in Jesus's resurrection. And that's what we got to be talking about, not family reunions. And for goodness sakes, not trying to scare people by talking about the torments of hell. I have real serious pastoral and theological problems with that.
Okay, I'm now going to head into a question, and it's heading down a little bit of a rabbit trail, Tim, but let me ask this question. I have worked in various situations with various different denominational pastors, and I've found that each of us as pastors has gained from the other traditions. I think one of my most helpful groups of people that I've worked with are Anglican pastors, because they come with a large body of information and heritage, and then just pass that on, and there's a whole sacramental area, and there's a whole area of liturgy that's just amazing out of that tradition. I come out of a very free-forming, just informal would be a way that I come. If as having an Anglican background, what would you say to some of us free-form, let her flow, let her go type of people about funeral services that make them memorable? Okay, I'm just wandering here, but yeah.
Well, the first comment I think would be just a little bit of a gentle dig.
Okay.
And you're not as free form as you think you are.
Oh, no, not even close.
If you stop and think about a typical free church Sunday service, and I'm talking about my own upbringing and a large chunk of my own pastoral experience as well. I'm not criticizing from the outside.
Yeah.
The church I grew up in, the service was never ever written down. And it was a sure sign of worldliness had it been written down. But from the age of 7 on, I could tell you exactly how that service was going to unfold. Hymn, welcome and announcements, opening prayer, hymn, testimony, hymn, offering, special and song, sermon, altar call, maybe, or dismissal, right? I mean, it wasn't written down, but it was as fixed a liturgy as any prayer book Anglican could ever, come up with. So I think the same is true of funerals. No matter how free-flowing a church imagines itself to be, when it comes to the major life passages, people fall into pretty established patterns. And that's good. Don't tinker with that. So that when the unforeseen happens, and it sometimes does, and I'll tell you a story about that in a second, you're not left completely flummoxed. So a number of years ago, a good friend of my parents, her name was Joyce, died. Joyce had been suffering with cancer for a long, long time. And she was a pillar in the local Pentecostal church. Her husband, Ron, was my dad's best friend. Like, this was going to be a command performance for the whole town. And as Ron's friend, I mean, any Perry who was within 100 miles of the Bethel Pentecostal Church in Shawville was going to be there for Joyce's funeral. So we're there. And about 10 minutes before the service starts, an usher comes up and whispers something in the pastor's ear. And there's no music, there's no prelude, nothing's happening. And you just see the pastor's face turn completely white. The organist had just died.
No. Okay.
True story.
Okay.
He had died that morning. He's a great guy too, but just stuff like that happens.
Yeah.
In a funeral, when it's already a high stress environment, if you don't have the major moves, at least in your head beforehand, something like that could really derail things. And the one thing you don't want the family to remember, if you're the minister, is how badly you got derailed.
Yeah. Okay. I hear more stories, and I've got more stories, but you know what? Our time's up, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, that's too bad.
Yeah, it is too bad. I'd love to continue this, and maybe one of these days we will, but thank you very, very much, Tim. This has been great. There's just some little tidbits and gems in there that I think are going to be very helpful. So thank you.
You're very, very welcome, Ron. Good to be with you today. This is all in a book called Funerals for the Care of Souls. Head over to leximpress.com and just search funerals or Perry, Perry, and the book will come up there. Order it from them, not from Amazon.
All right. Thanks again.
You're very welcome. Thanks, Ron.